Margaret Maggie Sullivan sat in her garden on a warm Tuesday morning. At 78 years old, she had earned these peaceful moments among her roses and tomato plants. The sun felt good on her wrinkled hands as she carefully cut dead leaves from her favorite rose bush. "Those are looking lovely this year," called a voice from the sidewalk. Maggie looked up to see Elaine Hodges making her way toward the garden gate. At 82, Elaine walked with a cane, but her back remained straight, a habit from her 40 years in the military. "Morning, Elaine." "You're early for knitting circle," Maggie said, checking her watch. "Thought I'd enjoy the walk while my joints are behaving," Elaine replied. "Is the kettle on?" Before Maggie could answer, a strange humming filled the air. Both women looked up. The clear blue sky suddenly darkened as enormous shapes blotted out the sun. "What in heaven's name?" Maggie whispered. 5 massive ships hovered above the town of Pineville. They were smooth, dark metal with glowing blue lines running along their undersides. Each one stretched at least a mile long. "Those aren't ours," said Elaine, her voice steady but tense. "I've seen every aircraft the government has built since 1960. Nothing looks like that." Maggie's phone rang. It was her grandson. "William." "Grandma, are you seeing this? Turn on your TV." His voice sounded panicked. "I'm seeing it right overhead, William. What's happening?" "They're everywhere, Grandma, all over the world, some kind of alien ships. They're saying on the news." William's voice cut off as the phone went dead. Across the neighborhood, lights flickered and went out. "Come inside," Maggie said to Elaine. "My emergency radio should still work." The 2 women hurried into Maggie's house. In the living room, 3 more elderly ladies were already gathered, eyes fixed on the silent television. Dorothy Bennett, 75, stood by the window, her biochemist's mind clearly analyzing what she saw. Patricia Patty Nguyen, 80, fiddled with her hearing aid, wincing at some high-pitched sound only she could hear. Eleanor Ellie Jackson, 76, former astronaut, watched the ships with professional interest. "They're using some kind of EMP," Ellie said. "Knocks out electronics, saw tests of similar weapons back at NASA." Maggie pulled an old hand-crank radio from a cabinet. As an engineer, she had kept simple backup systems around the house. She turned the crank and slowly adjusted the dial. "Advise all citizens to remain calm," a frightened voice said through bursts of static. "The visitors have identified themselves as the Drenari Empire. They claim to come in peace but demand immediate resource allocation and labor cooperation. Military response has been..." The voice cut off in static. "Labor cooperation," Elaine repeated with a snort. "I know an invasion when I see one." The ground shook as smaller ships descended toward the town center. From Maggie's front window, they watched metallic pods land in the park 2 blocks away. Tall, slender figures emerged, at least 7 feet tall with greenish-gray skin and 4 arms. "Dot, get away from the window," Patty said sharply. "Just observing," Dot replied, but she stepped back. "They appear to have an exoskeleton, like insects." More ships landed over the next hour. From Maggie's house, they watched as the aliens began moving through neighborhoods. They carried devices that projected their voices loudly. "All humans between ages 15 and 60 must report for processing and assignment," boomed an unnatural voice. Outside. "Resistance is inefficient and will result in termination. Elder humans are to remain in dwelling places until further notice." "Elder humans?" Dot said with raised eyebrows. "How considerate of them to dismiss us." "They're taking the workers," Elaine said grimly. "Classic invasion tactic. Control the labor force. Control everything." They watched helplessly as people were herded toward the park. Some tried to run and were immediately struck down by beams of blue light from alien weapons. As evening approached, the knitting circle gathered around Maggie's kitchen table, their usual spot on Tuesdays. None of them had been able to reach their families. Maggie worried most about William, his wife Laura, and their teenage children. "I need to check if they took them," Maggie said, putting on her jacket. "You can't go out there," Patty protested. "They said elders stay home. I'm just an old lady taking her evening walk," Maggie replied. "They won't bother with me." She was right. As Maggie slowly made her way toward William's house 6 blocks away, alien soldiers barely glanced at her. Their focus remained on younger humans. One soldier actually stepped aside, making a sound that might have been laughter as Maggie shuffled past with her cane. William's house stood empty, the door broken open. Family photos were smashed on the floor. In William's basement office, Maggie found his ham radio equipment untouched. She carefully disconnected the main components and hid them under her large cardigan. On her way home, she passed the park. Hundreds of people stood in lines being sorted by alien soldiers. She spotted William and Laura among them, but not the children. Perhaps they had hidden. Maggie wanted to call out, but knew it would only endanger them all. When she returned home, the others waited anxiously. "They've taken my family," Maggie said, voice breaking as she set William's radio equipment on the table. "But they left me his radio. Maybe we can use it somehow." "They made a mistake," Elaine said, her military training showing in her rigid posture. "They think we're harmless because we're old." "I noticed something strange," Patty said, tapping her hearing aid. "When they speak near me, my hearing aid picks up extra frequencies. It's like they're talking on 2 channels at once." "Could we listen in?" Ellie asked. "If Patty's hearing aid can receive their communications." "William's radio might help amplify it," Maggie said, examining the equipment. "I built systems like this during my engineering days." For the next few hours, they worked together. Maggie and Patty modified the radio with parts from their hearing aids. By midnight, strange sounds came through the speaker, clicks and hums, that slowly became understandable words as they adjusted the frequencies. "Processing of human labor units proceeding according to schedule," said an alien voice. "Elder humans classified as non-viable resources. No security concerns noted. Planet conquest at 42% completion." The 5 women looked at each other in the dim light of Maggie's battery-powered lantern. "Non-viable resources," repeated Dot softly. "They don't see us as threats. Or even as people worth watching," added Ellie. "Ladies," Maggie said, looking around at her friends, determination replacing her earlier grief. "They think we're harmless old women. They didn't even bother to guard us or take our things. That's going to be their first mistake." Elaine smiled grimly. "And their last, if I have anything to say about it." Outside, more ships arrived, casting blue light through the windows as the 5 grandmothers began to plan around the kitchen table. Their weekly knitting circle had just become something much more dangerous. The next morning, Maggie woke early. Her joints ached more than usual, but there was work to be done. She looked out her kitchen window and saw 3 more giant ships hovering over Pineville. Smoke rose from the direction of downtown. The doorbell rang. Maggie opened it to find Dot standing there with a large cloth bag. "I brought supplies," Dot said, entering without waiting for an invitation. She set the bag on the kitchen table and began unpacking various bottles and containers. "From my home lab. I thought they might be useful." "You still have your chemistry set?" Maggie asked. "Biochemistry," Dot corrected. "I may be retired, but I keep my hand in. These might help us understand our visitors." Within an hour, the rest of their group arrived. Elaine brought binoculars and maps of the town. Patty carried electronic parts salvaged from her home. Ellie brought freeze-dried food from her emergency supplies. "Always kept these around after NASA," Ellie explained. "Old habits." They gathered around Maggie's dining room table. On the wall, Elaine had pinned up a large map of Pineville. "What we know so far," Elaine said, pointing to different locations. "The Drenari have set up their main base at the shopping mall. They're holding people at the high school and community center. Work crews are being taken to the mines outside town and to the power plant." "What about the children?" Maggie asked, thinking of William's kids. "From what I could see," Patty said, "they're keeping them at the elementary school. Guards all around. But they don't seem to be harming them." Maggie felt slightly relieved but still worried. She adjusted the radio they had modified last night. More Drenari communications came through. "Human units responding well to basic commands," said an alien voice. "Elder population remaining inactive as predicted. Phase 2 begins tomorrow with resource extraction teams." "We need more information," Elaine said. "We need to get closer to their command center." And how do we do that? Ellie asked. We can't exactly walk up and knock. Dot smiled slyly. Actually, we can. She reached into her bag and pulled out a plastic container. I made cookies this morning. The others stared at her. Cookies? Patty asked. With a special ingredient, Dot explained. Based on what I observed of their physiology yesterday, I believe these will affect their nervous systems. Nothing deadly, just relaxing. You made alien sedative cookies? Ellie asked, impressed. Biochemist, Dot reminded them with a shrug. I notice things. Maggie looked at her friends. So we bring cookies to the aliens? Confused old ladies bringing baked goods, Elaine said, nodding approvingly. Perfect cover. They spent the day planning their mission while continuing to monitor Drenari communications. Maggie altered their hearing aids to better receive the alien frequencies. Patty turned knitting needles into small antennas to boost the signal. By evening, they were ready. Each woman dressed in her most elderly-looking outfit, cardigans, comfortable shoes, and large purses that hid small tools and devices. Dot packed her special cookies in a decorative tin. They walked slowly toward the mall, leaning on canes and each other. As they approached, they saw Drenari guards standing at each entrance. The aliens were tall with 4 arms and what looked like armor covering their greenish skin. Follow my lead, Elaine whispered. She put on a confused expression and walked directly toward the nearest guard, moving even slower than before. Excuse me, she called out in a wavering voice. Is this the senior center? We're here for bingo night. The guard looked down at the 5 elderly women. All 4 of its arms held weapons, but it made no move to use them. Elders returned to dwellings, it commanded in broken English. Oh my, what? An unusual young man, Elaine said loudly, pretending not to understand. We brought cookies for bingo night. Would you like one, dear? She nodded to Dot, who stepped forward with her tin. The other guards had noticed now. They made sounds that might have been laughter as they gathered around. Human elders malfunctioning, one said in their language, which came through clearly on the modified hearing aids. Non-threat status confirmed. The first guard reached out with one of its lower arms and took a cookie. After examining it, it put the whole thing in its mouth. The other guards followed, each taking cookies. Such nice boys, Dot said sweetly. Would you like to tell us about your home? You're not from around here, are you? As they expected, the guards found this hilarious. One of them actually bent down to talk to them like they were children. We Drenari, it said slowly. You stay here. We talk. Within minutes, the sedative in the cookies began to work. The guards became less alert, their posture relaxing. When one suggested showing the funny elders their command room, the others agreed. The women were escorted inside the mall. The interior had been transformed with strange technology. Drenari officers moved between stations with glowing screens. Central. Command impressive, yes? Their guide said, its speech becoming slurred. Very impressive, Maggie agreed, while Patty secretly recorded everything with a small camera hidden in her brooch. Their guide brought them to a large central area where maps and data displays showed Earth from orbit, with red dots marking invasion points. A senior Drenari officer noticed them and stormed over. Why are human elders here? He demanded of their guide. They bring food gifts. The guard replied sleepily. Show Earth knowledge. Before the officer could respond, several alarms began blaring. Guards rushed toward the mall's east entrance. Security breach in Sector 4, announced a voice over their communication system. With the command center in chaos, Maggie nodded to her friends. Each one moved to a prearranged position. Ellie began examining the orbital maps. Patty placed small devices near computer terminals. Dot observed the Drenari physical reactions to the emergency. Elaine noted the security patterns. Maggie approached an unmanned console. While everyone was distracted, she attached a small device William had built, a data collector that could download information from any system. Elders returned to homes now, a guard ordered, suddenly remembering them. Emergency protocol active. Oh dear. All this excitement is too much for my heart, Maggie said, placing a hand on her chest dramatically. Girls, I think we should go. They made their way out slowly, playing up their confusion. Once outside, they shuffled away as quickly as their elderly bodies allowed. Did you get it? Elaine asked when they were safely blocks away. Maggie patted her purse. Everything on their main computer. Plus, I left a little surprise in their system. And I placed the disruption devices, Patty added. They'll activate at midnight. Back at Maggie's house, they gathered around William's computer equipment. The data they had stolen revealed the Drenari's plans, mining operations, human processing, schedules, and most importantly, the location of all detention centers where their families were being held. They really don't consider us a threat, Ellie said, looking through the files. There's not a single security protocol for humans over 60. Their mistake, Elaine said with a grim smile. We need to organize. Spread the word to other seniors. Form cells. We need a name, Dot suggested. Every resistance needs a name. Maggie thought for a moment, then smiled. How about the Silver Resistance? At midnight, their devices activated throughout the mall. Drenari systems crashed, communications failed, and in the confusion, several humans managed to escape from the nearby holding area. In her living room, Maggie heard the distant sound of alarms. She smiled as she knitted a new scarf. This one, with a pattern that actually contained encoded maps of Drenari facilities. That's just the beginning, she told her friends. Tomorrow we start Operation Blue Rinse. News of the mall incident spread quickly among the senior citizens of Pineville. The Drenari increased patrols but continued to ignore the elderly. This was a mistake they would soon regret. 1 week after their first mission, the Silver Resistance had grown. Maggie's living room was now filled with elderly volunteers. Harold Garcia, an 85-year-old former bus driver, sat next to Elaine studying route maps. Linda Washington, a 72-year-old retired nurse, sorted medical supplies with Dot. Frank Miller, a 77-year-old locksmith, showed Patty how to make key copies from simple impressions. The information we got from their computer shows they're using the high school as the main processing center, Maggie said, pointing to a map spread on the dining table. People are being sorted there before being sent to work camps. My daughter and grandchildren were taken there 3 days ago, said a woman named Ruth. I watched from my porch as they were marched away. We're going to get them back, Maggie promised. All of them. From the data they had stolen, they learned the Drenari needed humans for mining operations. The aliens found Earth rich in rare minerals they called trilithium, which apparently powered their ships. Humans were the perfect size to access the narrow caves where the minerals were found. What's our next move? Harold asked. The underground tunnels, Maggie replied. Back in the 1960s, this town built fallout shelters and connecting tunnels. Most people forgot about them, but they're still there. How do you know about them? Linda asked. Maggie smiled. I helped design them. I was a civil engineer for the city for 40 years. She unrolled another map showing a network of tunnels running beneath Pineville. One passage ran directly beneath the high school. These tunnels connect most of the older buildings in town. The Drenari don't know they exist. We can use them to move people without being seen. They spent days preparing. Harold reconditioned an old school bus and hid it in a barn outside town. Frank made copies of keys for the tunnel access points. Dot and Linda prepared medical kits and food supplies. Ellie and Patty created communication devices from old radios and phone parts. Elaine organized the volunteers into teams, drawing on her military experience. Remember, we're not fighters, she told them. We're smugglers. Get in, get our people, get out. No heroics. On the night of their first rescue mission, 20 elderly men and women gathered in Maggie's basement. Most were in their 70s and 80s. Some used canes or walkers. All wore dark clothes with pockets full of useful items. The Drenari change guards at midnight, Maggie explained. There's a 10-minute window when security is lightest. We'll enter the tunnels at 11:30. Frank led the first group through Maggie's basement where he had discovered an old entrance to the tunnel system behind a false wall. They moved slowly but steadily through the narrow passages, flashlights lighting Their way. Maggie consulted her map at each junction. The tunnels smelled musty from years of disuse, but the concrete walls remained solid. She had built things to last. After 30 minutes of careful walking, they reached a ladder leading up to the high school boiler room. Frank climbed up first, unlocked the hatch with his homemade key, and signaled the all clear. Inside the high school, they could hear Drenari guards patrolling the halls. Elaine used hand signals she had taught everyone, directing them to split into teams. Maggie, Dot, and Harold would find the detention area. Elaine, Frank, and Linda would create a distraction. Patty and Ellie would handle communications. Maggie's team moved carefully through the dark halls. Through classroom windows, they could see people sleeping on floors, hundreds of them, families huddled together on thin mats. There, Dot whispered, pointing ahead. That's where they're keeping the children. The gymnasium doors were guarded by 2 Drenari soldiers. Just as they were wondering how to get past, alarms began blaring from the opposite end of the building. Lights flashed, and a recorded voice repeated instructions in the alien language. The guards looked at each other, then ran toward the disturbance. Elaine's team had set off the emergency system. Now, Maggie said. They hurried to the gym doors. Frank had given them keys that worked on most standard locks, and this one opened easily. Inside, children of all ages lay sleeping on gym mats. Among them, Maggie spotted William's children, Sam and Lucy. Her heart ached to see them looking so thin and tired. Everyone wake up, Harold called softly. We're here to help. Stay quiet and follow us. Confused faces turned toward them. A few children began to cry until Linda hushed them gently. We don't have much time, Maggie told them. The guards will return soon. Anyone who wants to leave, come with us now. Nearly 100 children gathered around them. Dot handed out small candies that she promised would help keep them energized. Harold organized them into lines. This way, Maggie said, leading them back toward the boiler room. Step quietly and stay together. As they neared their exit, a Drenari voice shouted behind them. A guard had spotted the tail end of their group. It raised its weapon. Go! Maggie shouted to the others. She turned and walked directly toward the guard, hunched over and moving slowly with her cane. Oh dear, she said in her most confused elderly voice. I'm looking for the bathroom. Can you help me, young man? The guard lowered its weapon slightly, making that sound again that seemed like laughter. Elder human returned to sleep area. I'm so forgetful these days, Maggie continued, shuffling closer. My memory isn't what it used to be. When she was within reach, she swung her cane hard, hitting the guard's knee joint, a weak spot Ellie had identified from her observations. The guard stumbled. Before it could recover, Maggie pressed a small device against its neck, one of Dot's special inventions that delivered a mild electric shock. The guard collapsed, twitching. Maggie hurried back to the others. In the tunnels, they moved as quickly as possible with so many children. Some of the older ones carried the youngest. The elderly volunteers brought up the rear, making sure no one was left behind. They emerged in the backyard of an abandoned house near the edge of town. Harold had the bus waiting. The children climbed aboard while lookouts watched for Drenari patrols. Where are we going? Sam asked Maggie as she helped him onto the bus. Somewhere safe, she promised. We have a place in the hills where the Drenari haven't looked. Other children are already there with some of our friends. As the bus pulled away, Maggie stayed behind with Frank and Dot. They had more work to do tonight. 3 more groups of seniors were entering the tunnels to rescue adults from other parts of the building. By morning, over 400 people had vanished from Drenari custody. The aliens were furious. Their patrols increased. They imposed stricter curfews and punishments, but they still didn't suspect the elderly. Back at her house, Maggie sipped tea while reviewing their success with the core team. They had established a camp in the hills where rescued humans could hide. They had a system for moving people through the tunnels. They had proven their plan could work. This is just the beginning, Elaine said. We need to hit them harder. We need to find out what they're doing with the trilithium, Ellie suggested. From what I saw in their files, they're processing it somewhere off-planet. Mars, Patty said suddenly. Everyone looked at her. I intercepted communications last night. They have a base on Mars where they're refining the minerals. That's where they're sending some of the workers. The room fell silent as they considered this. Well, said Maggie finally, setting down her teacup. I always did want to see Mars. Getting to Mars seemed impossible at first. But 3 weeks after their first rescue mission, the Silver Resistance had freed over 2,000 people from Drenari control. Among them were scientists, engineers, and even a few astronauts who had trained with Ellie years ago. The Drenari have shuttles that go back and forth to Mars, Ellie explained during their morning meeting. They land at the old airport outside town. One leaves every 3 days with new workers. Can we get aboard? One, Maggie asked. Maybe, said Paul Roberts, a 65-year-old former NASA technician they had rescued last week. But we'd need to understand their technology better. Patty had been working day and night to decode more Drenari communications. According to their schedules, they're sending another group tomorrow night, 50 humans and 10 guards. We need to take that shuttle, Elaine said firmly. A small team. Get to Mars, find out what they're doing there, and figure out how to stop them. And how exactly do we do that? Dot asked. None of us have been to space except Ellie. I've been thinking about that, Ellie said. The Drenari don't check the humans they transport very carefully. They just count heads. If we could replace some of the workers with our people. They spent the day planning. Frank created fake worker badges based on ones they had collected. Paul studied the shuttle designs from the data they had stolen. Dot prepared special medications to help them handle the journey. Space travel is hard on the body, she explained, mixing powders in her makeshift lab. Especially for folks our age, this will help with the pressure changes and gravity shifts. Who's going? Linda asked. A small team, Maggie decided. Me, Elaine, Dot, Patty, and Ellie. We have the most experience, and frankly, we started this thing. Harold shook his head. You're all in your 70s and 80s. This isn't like walking through some tunnels. This is space. Exactly why. It has to be us, Elaine replied. The Drenari will never suspect seniors, and if something goes wrong, the Resistance needs its younger members to carry on. By younger, she meant the 60-somethings who now made up much of their group. That night, they made final preparations. Each woman packed only essential items, medications, communication devices, and small weapons Frank had designed that wouldn't set off Drenari security. You'll need these, Paul said, handing them each an oxygen mask. The air on their ships is thinner than what humans are used to. Most workers struggle with it. Just before dawn, Harold drove them to a spot near the airport. They could see the Drenari shuttle on the runway, a sleek, dark vessel with the same blue lights they had seen on the larger ships. Workers are loaded through that side entrance, Patty said, pointing. Guards check badges at the door, then they're herded inside. They watched as a line of tired-looking humans walked toward the shuttle surrounded by Drenari guards. Most were middle-aged men and women, dressed in simple uniforms. Now, Elaine whispered. The 5 women emerged from their hiding place and shuffled toward the back of the line. They had practiced walking like exhausted workers rather than their usual elderly gaits. Each wore a gray uniform with a forged badge. A guard at the shuttle door barely glanced at them as they showed their badges. Inside, they found rows of bench seats filled with silent, fearful humans. The women separated and sat in different areas, as planned. The shuttle interior was cramped and cold. The lights were too bright for human eyes, making everyone squint. 2 guards remained inside with the workers while the others left. With a sound like thunder, the shuttle doors sealed. Everyone lurched as the engines started. Maggie gripped her seat as they began to rise. She had never flown in anything larger than a commercial airplane, and this was very different. The acceleration pressed them into their seats. Dot discreetly passed out her special tablets to those sitting nearby. Through small windows, Maggie watched Earth fall away below them. In just minutes, they were in space. The journey to Mars took 14 hours. The workers were given no food and only small cups of water. The guards seemed amused by their discomfort. Maggie noticed many of the younger humans were already struggling to breathe in the thin air. She was grateful for Paul's oxygen mask hidden in her sleeve. When they finally landed, the workers were ordered to stand in lines. The doors opened to reveal a red-tinted dome structure. Through transparent sections, Maggie could see the rusty landscape of Mars stretching into the distance. "Welcome to Mining Colony 6, a Drenari supervisor announced as they shuffled out of the shuttle. "You will work, eat, and sleep according to schedule. Deviations result in punishment. Productivity results in better rations." The women stayed separate but exchanged quick glances as they were led through the dome. The facility was much larger than it had appeared from outside, with tunnels leading deep below the surface. Workers were sorted by size and strength. The strongest were sent to operate heavy machinery. The smallest were directed to mining tunnels. Those with technical skills were assigned to processing plants. "You," a guard said, pointing at Maggie and her friends, "too old for mining, laundry, and food service." This was exactly what they had hoped for. Kitchen and laundry workers had more freedom to move around the base. The women were taken to a large room filled with washing machines and piles of dirty uniforms. Two bored guards explained their duties, then left them alone with several other, older workers. "Phase 1 complete," Maggie whispered to Dot as they sorted laundry. "Now we map this place and find the control systems." Over the next 3 days, they learned the layout of the Mars base. During work shifts, they carefully observed guard patterns and security systems. At night, in the crowded barracks, they whispered their findings to each other. Patty discovered the main communications room during a cleaning assignment. Ellie found the shuttle bay where smaller vehicles were kept. Dot identified the processing plant where the trilithium was refined into fuel cells. Elaine, who was assigned to the kitchens, made an even more important discovery. "They're storing the processed trilithium in containers at the north end of the base," she told them on the third night. "But there's something odd about it. They're keeping it at a very specific temperature and pressure." "What happens if those conditions change?" Maggie asked. "According to what I overheard, it becomes useless as fuel. They called it contamination." On the fourth day, during their lunch break, they finalized their plan. It would be dangerous and they might not make it back to Earth. But if they succeeded, they could cripple the Drenari operations throughout the solar system. "The processing controls are in the central chamber," Ellie said quietly. "If we can alter the settings, we could contaminate their entire fuel supply." "We'll need a distraction," Elaine added. "Something big enough to draw all the guards away." Maggie thought about William and his family, about all the people still held captive on Earth. "I think it's time," she said, "for these aliens to learn what happens when they underestimate a group of determined grandmas." That night, as the Mars base grew quiet, 5 elderly women slipped out of their bunks and began the most important mission of their lives. Moving silently through the darkened Mars base, the 5 women split into teams as planned. Elaine and Dot headed for the kitchen area. Patty and Ellie made their way toward the communication center. Maggie went alone to the processing plant. Each woman carried small devices they had built using parts smuggled from Earth and items stolen during their days working in the base. Their plan had 3 parts: distraction, sabotage, and escape. Elaine and Dot reached the kitchen without being seen. The Drenari ate different food than humans, stored in special containers at specific temperatures. "Ready?" Elaine asked. Dot nodded and began mixing powders she had secretly collected from the laundry chemicals. "This won't harm them, but it will make them very uncomfortable for about an hour." She poured her mixture into the food containers set out for the next day's meals. Meanwhile, Elaine rewired the kitchen alarm system. When she finished, she pressed a small button on her wristwatch. "Distraction set," she whispered into the watch, which Patty had converted into a communicator. In the communication center, Patty received the message. She and Ellie had hidden in a supply closet waiting for the right moment. Now they moved toward the main control panel. "2 guards," Ellie whispered. Patty smiled and pulled out what looked like a hearing aid. "Cover your ears." She turned the device on and placed it on the floor. It emitted a high-pitched sound that humans over 70 could barely hear, but which affected the Drenari painfully. The guards clutched their heads and rushed from the room trying to escape the noise. "Works every time," Patty said, picking up the device. They have very sensitive hearing, much better than ours. Ellie sat at the control panel and began pressing buttons. I can broadcast a message to all human workers, but I need 3 minutes. You've got 2, Patty replied, watching the door. Meanwhile, Maggie had reached the processing plant. Unlike the others, she had chosen to hide in plain sight. She wore her work uniform and carried cleaning supplies. When a guard spotted her, she just smiled and pointed to a dirty floor. Clean, she said simply. The guard made that now familiar sound of Drenari laughter and waved her past. They still thought humans her age were harmless. Inside the main processing room, enormous machines converted raw trilithium into fuel cells. Maggie found the temperature control panel exactly where Ellie had described it. She pulled out a device Paul had built for her, a simple override that would gradually raise the temperature beyond safe levels. As she worked, an alarm suddenly blared throughout the base. Lights flashed red. A voice announced something in the Drenari language. "Attention all human workers," came Ellie's voice over the speaker system, first in English, then repeated in several other languages. "This is the Silver Resistance. The Drenari have been lying to you. Earth is fighting back. In 1 hour we will disable their fuel production. Find shelter immediately. Prepare for evacuation." Guards ran past the processing room, heading toward the communication center. Maggie worked faster, attaching her device to the control panel. When it was secure, she pressed the activation button. The temperature gauges began to rise slowly. "Sabotage complete," she said into her watch. "Meeting at extraction point in 10 minutes. The extraction point was a small shuttle bay they had discovered during their exploration of the base. Paul had taught Ellie how to pilot the Drenari shuttles. They weren't much different from spacecraft she had trained on years ago. As Maggie made her way there, chaos erupted throughout the base. Human workers were leaving their stations. Guards ran in all directions. Through windows, she could see Drenari officers outside the dome, doubling over in discomfort as Dot's special mixture took effect. When she reached the shuttle bay, the others were already there. Ellie was inside a small transport vessel working on the controls. Patty stood watch at the door. "Where's Elaine and Dot?" Maggie asked. "Not here yet," Patty said, worry in her voice. "They should have." The door at the far end of the bay slid open. Dot appeared, helping Elaine, who was limping badly. "Guard caught us," Dot explained as they hurried over. "Elaine's knee is injured. I'm fine," Elaine insisted, though her face was tight with pain. "Just get us out of here." They helped her into the shuttle. Ellie had managed to start the engines, and the small craft hummed with power. "I've never flown one of these before," she admitted. "Only simulations, hold on tight." The bay doors were closed, but Patty had planned for this. During her cleaning duties, she had placed a small explosive charge on the control panel. She pressed a button on her watch, and with a loud bang, the panel sparked and shorted out. The doors began to slowly slide open as the emergency system activated. "That's our cue," Ellie said, gripping the controls. The shuttle lifted off the ground and shot forward through the partially opened doors, scraping the sides with a terrible screeching noise. Then they were out, rising quickly into the thin Martian atmosphere. Behind them, alarms continued to blare in the base. Through the rear window, they could see Drenari guards pouring from the dome, pointing up at them. "They'll follow us," Elaine said grimly. "Not for long," Maggie replied. She looked at her watch. The temperature in the processing plant should reach critical level in about 5 minutes. They watched as the base grew smaller below them. Suddenly, a bright flash erupted from one section of the dome. Then another. The processed trilithium was becoming unstable. "I didn't set it to explode," Maggie said, alarmed. "No," Dot agreed. "But when trilithium becomes contaminated, it releases a lot of energy. Not enough to destroy the base, but enough to disable all their systems." The shuttle shook as Ellie directed it upward, away from Mars and toward Earth. Behind them, the entire dome facility had gone dark. "Will they be able to follow us?" Patty asked. Ellie shook her head. "Not anytime soon. Without power, they're stuck. And without proper fuel, none of their ships can travel far." The 5 women looked at each other, finally allowing themselves to smile. They had done it. The Drenari's main fuel processing facility was disabled. Without it, their fleet would slowly become stranded. The journey back to Earth took longer than their trip to Mars. Ellie had to navigate carefully, conserving the shuttle's fuel. They took turns sleeping in the cramped space. Dot treated Elaine's injured knee as best she could with their limited supplies. As Earth grew larger in their viewport, they received a transmission from their resistance friends. The message was brief but clear. Drenari ships failing. Invasion weakening. Your plan worked. 3 days after leaving Mars, they entered Earth's atmosphere. Ellie guided the shuttle toward the hills outside Pineville where the Resistance had its main camp. As they descended, they could see hundreds of people gathered below watching their approach. Harold was the first to reach them when they landed. "You crazy old ladies," he said, helping Elaine from the shuttle. "You actually did it." People surrounded them, cheering and asking questions all at once. Through the crowd, Maggie spotted William and his family. She pushed forward and gathered her grandchildren in her arms. "Grandma," Lucy said, "they're saying you went to Mars, is that true?" "It is," Maggie replied. "Not bad for an old lady, right?" That evening, as Resistance members celebrated around campfires, news arrived from around the world. Drenari ships were falling from the sky, unable to maintain power. Their ground forces were retreating to their remaining functional vessels. The contaminated fuel had spread throughout their fleet faster than anyone had expected. The 5 friends sat together, sharing a quiet moment away from the celebrations. "What happens now?" Dot asked. "Now," Elaine said, "we help rebuild. Our world has changed forever." "And the Drenari?" Patty asked. "They'll remember Earth," Maggie said confidently. "They'll remember the planet where their mighty empire was defeated by a group of grandmas with knitting needles and hearing aids." Ellie smiled. "Not just any grandmas, the wrong grandmas to pick a fight with." As stars appeared above them, the 5 women clinked their teacups together. The Silver Resistance had won, not with advanced weapons or armies, but with wisdom, patience, and the power of being underestimated.